Welcome back to our continued study of Swinburne's The Coherence of Theism. Today we're in Chapter 8. We're going to be discussing what it means to say that God is perfectly free and creator and sustainer of the universe. So our plan for today is to begin by filling out the notion of what it is to say that God is creator and sustainer of the universe. We're going to discuss several views on the laws of nature and the nature of causation. And then we're going to talk a bit about perfect freedom, personal explanation, and what it is to act for reasons. So part of the content of theism is the claim that God is creator of the universe. Here the universe is understood as the complete system of all physical and mental substances that are spatially related to the earth. It's the totality of all physical and mental substances. The idea that God is the creator of the universe means that God creates everything that is in existence, with the understanding that God doesn't create himself. That would require self-causation, which is incoherent, and also that God doesn't create abstracta. So there's a debate here. You can read up on Platonism, but it's compatible with theism that abstracta, sets, numbers, mathematical truths aren't created by God, that they're necessary objects. In addition to thinking that God created the universe, theism is committed to the claim that God sustains everything in existence. So theism is different from deism. On a deistic view, we can think of as a being like God that creates the universe and no longer interacts with the universe, that the universe runs on its own power, so to speak, after it's established. Theism, in contrast, is the idea that the universe is actively sustained by God every moment in its existence. So here I want to point you to the direction of a really nice article by Peter Van Inwagen called The Place of Chance in a World Sustained by God. And I want to note a qualification that Swinburne makes to the idea that God creates and sustains all things. So Swinburne writes that all things, however, is normally understood in one respect far more widely than I have analyzed so far, so as to include not merely all substances, but also all things that happen to substances, that is, the occurrences of logically contingent events. All the events in the world are caused by God, including the beginnings and endings of substances, and also their acquiring and losing properties. For example, God not merely creates the planets, but creates their motions around the sun, their changes of temperature, their collisions with comets, and so on. So God causes substances to behave in the way codified by laws of nature, such as the law of universal attraction, and also causes substances to behave in ways not determined by laws of nature. And God causes the occurrence of the pure mental events, such as the sensations and thoughts of humans and the higher animals. So in summary, God causes the occurrence of all logically contingent events apart from his own existence, and all logically contingent events entailed by his existence. So the idea that God is creator and sustainer of the universe is the idea that there is a being that creates, sustains actively every substance and property of substance at every moment in its existence. I want to also note that there is a debate coming from Aquinas and Aquinas' reliance on Aristotle's cosmology about whether it's consistent with theism to understand that the universe may be eternal, and Aquinas argues that it does. And Swinburne discusses this briefly, so I'll let you look at what Swinburne says there. When the theist says that God causes all logically contingent events, how does this fit with the idea that humans cause things in virtue of the causal powers that humans have? So theism is typically understood as the idea that God gives substances their own causal powers, and it's in virtue of their having causal powers that they can then cause things to exist, so that there are true causes of logically contingent events that don't have as their direct cause God's activity. So I want to point out that there is a position developed by Malebranche. It's called occasionalism. And the idea is that for Malebranche, God is the true and sole cause of everything, and that the common sense idea that humans cause things in virtue of their causal powers is mistaken. Rather, the thought is that humans have intentions to perform certain acts, and God brings about those acts on the occasion of them forming the intention. So there's a perfect harmony between my forming the intention to raise my arm and God bringing about that my arm is raised. So Swinburne summarizes this discussion, he says that the doctrine that there is an omnipresent spirit who is the creator of the universe is to be understood in view of the tradition of theism as follows. There is an omnipresent spirit who either himself causes or permits other beings to cause or permit the occurrence of all logically contingent events, apart from any, the occurrence of which is entailed by his own existence. So let's move on to talk more in detail about accounts of causation. So what Swinburne is going to do in the next section here is he's going to discuss 3 different views about laws of nature and causation in order to help us better understand what it means to say that God is creator. God is the sole cause of the universe existing. So the first view of causation and laws of nature is called the Humean regularity view. So for Hume, what a law of nature is a universal regularity. Hume is concerned here to offer a view of a law of nature that isn't committed to mysterious entities, such as a relation of natural necessity that holds between 2 events. So if you think, for example, of a simple case of where one object causes another object to move, you can see where one object strikes another object, that the other object then moves in a certain direction. And Hume says if we try to analyze what's going on there, we look as closely as we can, we see that one object begins to move, it strikes or makes contact with another object, and then the second object moves. But if we analyze as closely as we can this contact, we don't see a transfer of energy. We don't see a relation of natural necessity. We don't see that given this one thing, some other thing must happen. We just see that when this happens, this other thing happens. And it doesn't matter how closely you look. If you have an electron microscope and somehow or another you're able to look at this event with electron microscope eyes, you will never see a transfer of energy. You'll just see one thing happen and then another thing happen. And so for Hume, he thinks that one can offer an account of a law that doesn't need to appeal to this mysterious idea of natural necessity. So in Hume's view, what a law of nature is that events of one type always follow events of another type, in which case it's a law of nature that if A, then B. So we might say that it's a law of nature that water freezes when it reaches 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And what this amounts to on Hume's view is that the events of one kind, events of water reaching 32 degrees Fahrenheit, are followed by events of water turning into ice. This account is applied to causes in the following way. Causes are a consequence of the true universal regularities. So a particular event E causes another event G if and only if E belongs to a kind A and G belongs to a kind B, where all A's or B's is a law of nature. So let's think about a case. Drinking hemlock caused Socrates to die. We think of an event, Socrates drinking hemlock, is of a kind A, and this is a kind of individuals drinking hemlock. And G is the event that Socrates dies, is of kind B, the kind being individuals that die. And it's a universal regularity that every individual that drinks hemlock dies. So the hemlock causes Socrates to die, or Socrates drinking the hemlock causes Socrates to die. Now there is a well-known problem to Hume's account. This is a problem that some regularities are universal and they're true, but they're not law-like. Consider the statement that all spheres of gold are less than a mile in radius. This is true, but it's not a law-like statement. There's nothing about the nature of gold that makes it the case that it's less than a mile in radius. It just happens to be a particular fact. Or consider the fact that every human born has been born on the surface of the earth. That's also a true universal regularity, but it's not a law-like regularity. David Lewis develops Hume's account of laws in a way that answers this question. The basic idea for Lewis is that a true law of nature is an axiom in the best systematization of all true facts. So you're not going to find as an axiom that all spheres of gold are less than a mile in radius, and it's not going to be entailed by the axioms that claim holds true. Similarly, in the case of humans being born on the surface of the earth, is that that's not going to be entailed by the axioms. The axioms are basically going to be the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, laws of biology, and so on. So Swinburne discusses 2 other views of laws of nature, and remember here that the big picture, where this is going, is to better understand what it is for a person to cause something. So one view is known as RBU, or relations between universals. And the idea is that what a law is it's a relation between universals, or in Swinburne's term, a relation between properties. And the idea here is that laws express logically contingent relations of natural necessitation between universals. So you can look at Michael Tooley's excellent paper here, The Nature of Laws. The way I think about this is from a computer programming perspective. So if you are designing a game and you want to make it a feature of the game that whenever an individual approaches a large body of water, they can walk across that body of water, you can program into the game that all events of a person approaching a large body of water is able to walk across the surface of the water to get to the other side. Now, that is a logically contingent relation for the purposes of the game, but in virtue of programming it in there, it becomes a law of the game. The thought is applied to natural laws is that there is a relationship of natural necessity, but it is a relation, it's a logically contingent relation that holds between universals. So let's look here at what Swinburne says about this account. He says that on this account, for example, Newton's law of gravity, the law that every material object having a mass m and every other material object having a mass m prime, is followed by the two objects having an acceleration toward each other, which is expressed by the inverse square law. Newton's law of gravity is to be analyzed as there being a relation of physical necessity joining the universals of mass, distance, and force of such a kind that when universals of mass m, there's a typo there, and mass m prime are instantiated in two material objects at distance r from each other, there's a force of attraction between them proportional to the product of the masses divided by the distance squared. The final kind of law of nature is called the substances, powers, and liabilities account. And on this view, the idea is that laws are regularities in the causal powers and liabilities of substances. So you can read here Ellis's book, Scientific Essentialism. So we're going to get a better sense of how these views work as we compare them and then we apply them to personal explanation. So we're going to ask two questions about these accounts, which will help us come to grips with how they compare and contrast. So let's ask first, what kinds of things are causes? On the Humean regularity view, and the view that says that laws are relations between universals, it implies that events are causes. And this is because the nature of the view. In the Humean regularity view, the laws are relations between events. There's an event of one kind, and there's an event of another kind, and it's a law of nature if events of this one kind are always followed by events of this other kind. And the relations between universals view says that a law is a relation between universals. And so you have an event that instantiates various universals of one kind, and it's followed by an event that instantiates other universals. And this is because of the nature of the relation between the universals. So what the true causes are is read off by the nature of the laws. So the laws in the way are the fundamental entities. The SPL account, the account that laws are to be understood as in powers and liabilities of substances, implies that substances are causes. So the second question is, what's the relationship between the laws of nature and causes? So in the Humean regularity view and the view that laws are relations between universals, laws of nature are basic realities and causation is a consequence of the operation of the laws. On the substances, powers, and liabilities view, causation is the basic reality, and laws of nature are regularities in the causal powers of substances. So why does this all matter? This all matters so that we can better understand what it is to say that a person is a cause. So we turn to that now. So Swinburne remarks that persons are substances, and when they cause events intentionally, they cause them by having intentions. So here the idea is that persons have basic causal powers. Swinburne argues that we can't understand these causal powers in terms of events that would be explained on the Humean regularity view or the relations between universals view. So he writes on page 136, he says, the exercise of intentional agency is not to be analyzed as an event in the agent, a brain state or a mental state such as a desire with which the agent finds himself, causing an effect in virtue of some law of nature. For he continues, he says, for such a state might cause some bodily movement without the agent intending the movement to happen, and then it would not constitute an intentional action. So let's look at the implication that he draws here. He says that a person causes events in virtue of his intentions, beliefs, and powers, whether or not other persons cause the same effect under similar circumstances. This kind of causation, which I call intentional causation, is not reducible to any account of causation that derives it from laws of nature, such as the regularity or the relations between universal accounts. For on the latter accounts, the causes are events, whereas in intentional causation, they are substances, and causation, or more precisely exercising causal influence, is an unanalyzable relation, and so not analyzable in terms of laws of nature. He then notes that intentional causation conflicts with the human regularity view and the relations between universals view, but it does fit well with the substances, powers, and liabilities account. Because on this latter account, causal powers are had by substances, and in the case of a person intending to bring something about and bringing it about, that is a primitive causal power of a person. So where this is all headed is Swinburne's idea that to understand God's creating, that God's causing things, we need to understand this as a causal power of a substance. And we understand it in a way that this being acts for reasons, similar to the way that humans act for reasons. So the idea here is that there's no scientific explanation for God's actions. There's no prior state that what factors that cause God to act are God's intentions, powers, and beliefs, similarly to the way that we think of individuals as acting, and we can explain their action in terms of their intentions, their powers, and their beliefs. This is an important point, and we will come back to this in the second book of the trilogy, where Swinburne's going to argue that if you can determine what this being's intentions and powers and beliefs are, then you can determine what this being will bring about, and you can use this to go out and then figure out whether those states have obtained, in which case it becomes evidence for this being's existence. This is an important section of the book to pay attention to because it's important for the overall project. So how should we understand this idea that God is perfectly free? So Swinburne makes a couple points. He says God's acts are not random. It's not as if God is spinning like a roulette wheel to try to determine what's going to be done. He's like, come on, Black 17, Black 17 happens and this is going to happen and I'm going to do that. That's not the way to think of God's actions, and God's actions aren't in a way thought of as like the spontaneous decay of like electrons in a particular atom. Moreover, God's acts aren't spontaneous. It's not as if God, in a way, wakes up one day and is like, all right, now I'm going to do this. I'm like, why are you doing that? Oh, just, had this crazy idea. Just it popped into my head. Rather, the idea is that God acts for the reasons that there are. And God's acts are not influenced by non-rational factors. And so there's a good sense of action being perfectly free when that action is determined only by the reasons that there are, and the agent is able to see and appreciate those reasons and chooses the act on the basis of those reasons. So on Swinburne's account, he says the analysis of the claim that there's an omnipresent spirit who's perfectly free and is a creator of the universe amounts to this, that there's a person P who is an omnipresent spirit and intentionally causes or permits all events that happen, and no non-rational causal factor influences P to form his intentions. So the last part of Swinburne's analysis here is to figure out how to understand the relationship between freedom and reason. And he begins with the idea that comes from Socrates that whenever an individual intentionally performs an act, they regard that act as good in some sense or another. Now, agents like us can be influenced to act against our considered best judgment by non-rational factors. If I want to run a very good time in the next 10K, then I should not eat so much ice cream. But I might think, well, this ice cream looks really good, and I'm going to eat the ice cream. So the non-rational factors there of being motivated to eat, very good ice cream can lead me to act against my best judgment that I really want a personal record in the next 10K that I run. Now, we think of an omnipresent spirit as being perfectly free so that their judgments aren't clouded or influenced by non-rational factors. This has an important upshot, is that a perfectly free agent will never do an act if that agent believes that it's overall bad, and will always perform an act if that agent believes it's for the best. So this is really important because if you can determine that an act is for the best, and you know that you have a perfectly free agent, also a perfectly good agent, then you can determine what that agent is going to do. Now, there is a challenge here from the idea that in many cases there are a number of incompatible good options, and so what should a perfectly free or good agent do in this case? So the case to think about is like giving to charity. If you have a large amount of money in the bank, you could always save that money for a bit longer and then give more to charity. But recognizing that you're in this position, you realize that if you continue to wait, you're never going to give any money to charity because you could always do a better thing. And so one idea here is that, well, it's perfectly acceptable to reach a point where you think this is good enough and you give the money to charity. If you're interested in reading up on this, this is known as satisficing, and there's a discussion of this in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Okay, so the picture we get here is that God is a perfectly free agent that will always perform the best action if there is a best. And if there's not a best, then God will perform a perfectly good act. All right, so next up is chapter 9 on omnipotence.